2-week sprints are the default almost everywhere, and they're often wrong. Iteration length isn't about meeting cadence. It's about how fast you learn and how reliably you deliver value. Today, I'll show you a simple way to choose the right length for your team. By the end, you'll know how to set an iteration length you can defend, adjust, and use to reduce thrash. This is Building Better Games. I'm Benjamin Carcich, leadership trainer, coach, and game producer. I was once advising a well-funded startup. They were on 2-week sprints, and without warning, they switched to 3 weeks just because there were too many sprint meetings. This was really sad for me because I was about to recommend that they switch to 1-week sprints, but obviously they wouldn't have gone for that because they already felt like there were so many meetings. The result wasn't great. There were fewer checkpoints, there were slower learning. I think it led to worse predictability and a lot of just lag and drag inside the system. They tuned for their leader meeting comfort, not for value flow. And the key lesson here, iteration length is a product lever, not a calendar convenience for your leadership. I'm going to introduce a model, and the model are 3 dials that you should use to tune your iteration length. So the 3 dials to turn to set your iteration length. First one, chunk size. What's the value cadence? How long does it take you to produce a valuable increment of whatever your product is, something that meaningfully changes the experience for whoever the audience is, or to create a meaningful learning slice? Sometimes you might get both in one, but those are the 2 things you're going to be focusing on. How long does it take to produce a valuable increment or a meaningful learning slice? And I've had this go in a lot of different directions. The simple example, I had a character development team that went in 3-day or sometimes even shorter cycles, but 3 days, let's say, was our norm. And that worked really well because the team would come together. We had art, we had design doing some paper kitting and some rough ideas of what this might look like. And we had narrative writing the background of the story. And we knew we had to get through this in a fairly short amount of time overall. We just asked, what are the biggest questions we have? We tackled those questions, the most important ones. And however far we gotten in 3 days, we took a look. And a lot of times we'd have some of them answered. Sometimes we wouldn't have them all answered. There might have been something that got stuck or something that had to be reviewed or whatever it was. But every 3 days was a good cycle for us to go back and review and say, okay, what are the next most important questions? Okay, what are the next most important questions? Sometimes we didn't even have a complete answer, but we had a good enough answer that that thing no longer was a blocker for that character moving forward. So this was a way that in character ideation, we actually had really, really tight, small chunk sizes. Like I said, 3 days. Different environment. Live ops, back-end stuff where we were dealing with player servers, tools, things like that. A lot of validation was needed because this was a live service. Stability was key here. We needed to have enough time to really test well because if anything ever went wrong, it would be a huge potential player impact. We picked a longer cadence in this case because to actually create a valuable increment with all the validation that was required around quality and bug checking and all these sorts of things, performance and whatnot, it just took longer to make sure everything was clean and smooth before we would check it in to a live build. So it shifted our cadence. The chunk size to get a valuable increment was higher, and we weren't doing as much learning in that case because it was a live service product. We had a better understanding of what we were trying to do from the live game. So what you want to do is pick a length where most iterations end up with visible value and or learning. If that isn't happening, shorten or thin your slices. So you can both shorten the iteration. You could also try to take smaller chunks. And you don't want this to get too long either. That's something else we got to be careful of. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Dial number 2, volatility. How much does the priority change of what's most important? So when you're in a high churn state, this is common at the beginning of game development. Maybe, or whatever you're doing, the beginning of it, almost anything, whenever you're in the ideation or the concepting phase, the prototyping phase, or sometimes when you're towards the end, when you're in a just about to go live and everybody's, trying to burn down bugs, or if a crisis happens, oftentimes you want a faster rate of change inside of whatever your iteration is. Sometimes you even want to abandon iterations altogether, but you want a faster rate of change. So that allows you to adapt to all those things that are happening. When you have a stable roadmap with not a lot of change, not a lot of injections of priority shifts or the most important thing becoming something else, you can go longer. I would rarely ever want to go beyond 2 weeks, honestly, in the game dev space, because I just think you end up losing feedback and people start dragging their feet a little bit. Anytime I've seen 3-week sprints or 4-week sprints, especially, you start seeing the first week or two being handled very casually by everybody involved. It's almost just a natural human thing. If you give me 6 weeks to get my paper done in college, most people do it in the last week. This can happen. And so instead, having tighter durations keeps people focused. And that does mean you take on smaller pieces of work when you do smaller things, when you take on shorter durations rather. But it means that you're more likely to get them done. And so you take smaller chunks and you get smaller chunks moving faster. And again, that leads to faster value, faster learning. That's what you want. The higher the volatility, the shorter your iterations probably need to be. And this may eventually shift. You may end up going to a place very naturally where you go from ideation and prototyping into pre-production and production, and suddenly there's a little bit less volatility. There's a little bit more known. There's not as many injections of priority changes because we're locking in. We're figuring out what the game is. We have more answers now, fewer questions, and we're more executing what we know. That's when it might be okay to expand. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so if dial number 1 was chunk size, like what does it take to produce a valuable increment or a meaningful learning slice? Dial number 2 is how much volatility is there in your system around priority change. Dial number 3 is just human rhythm. How do we make this legible? So people think in days, weeks, months. These are natural ways. I think this is why another reason 2-week cycle became so popular. It's just like, oh, that makes sense. It's like half a month and it's 2 weeks and these sorts of things. But if you were to do some analysis and look at those first 2 dials and you were to say, oh, the chunk size, we have a chunk size and we're looking at volatility and we should have a 3.75 day cycle. You don't actually want to do that. That's pretty ridiculous. What you should probably do is just make it a week, and it won't be perfect, but it will be very legible for the people involved and they'll be able to get into rhythm because you do want your team to be able to get into rhythm. That can be one of the things that's challenging when you go with like a 2-day or a 3-day cadence. It doesn't nest nicely into weeks. And, especially if someone's like, oh, our optimal is a 12 working day pattern. It's like, well, that's almost 2.5 weeks and it gets really clunky. So if you're looking at something and it's around a week, go with a week. If you're doing that analysis and it's like, shoot, stuff changes a lot, go with 2 to 3 days. I've also done a thing where I've rotated a 3-day, 2-day weekly rhythm. But just choose lengths that people can remember and easily coordinate across teams. And in this, I'll let you know my default around human rhythm, start at 1 week. It's intuitive, builds trust quickly, usually fits both engineering and artists and everybody. If you're working in a system that's functional, like technically, you can usually get small chunks of work or small chunks of learning done inside of a week. So that's a great place to start. It also, again, leads to a natural flow around predictability. You can start seeing, okay, hey, in 4 weeks, we got this much work done. So I can start projecting what might get done in the next 4 weeks or 8 weeks or 16 weeks or whatever it is. Okay, why do we do iterations? What are they trying to gain? So one of the major reasons iterations work when they work is because of a trait. It's the reciprocal commitment. The reciprocal commitment works like this. The team says, you leave us alone for this iteration, for this time box. We're taking this time, whether it's a week, 2 weeks, 3 days, whatever it is, and we are going to finish what we said we're going to finish. We planned what we're going to do. We're going to do it. And the leaders say, okay, I'm going to leave you alone. They say, we're going to judge you at the end. We aren't going to inject ourselves and churn you mid-iteration because we recognize that could be a huge problem. And our expectation is that the majority of the time, you actually do finish what you said. But as long as that's happening, we've got this reciprocal commitment. Trust will be built up, and this will work really well. What happens a lot of time is one or the other side breaks this. And when that happens, the system collapses. And a lot of the value that iterations are intended to provide falls apart. This will lead to a lack of trust. When trust is low, you have to fix that. Trust being low means that no matter what iterations you pick, it doesn't matter. No matter what processes you pick, it doesn't matter. So when trust is low, you have to figure out how to fix that. Sometimes that's through setting an iteration and holding to it as the team. Sometimes for leaders, that's through really, even when it seems like the right thing to continue to inject yourself into the team and mess with their priority, to really back off and let the team do what you asked it to do. Doing the not optimal thing, but getting it all the way to done is better than starting a bunch of things and not getting them to done. Does this sound familiar? You're in a leadership role at a game studio. Everyone is busy working. No one has any time. But the actual game itself isn't in a good spot. Maybe it's the tech. Maybe it's the lack of a validated prototype. Maybe it's that every person seems to have a different idea about what we're trying to build. But you've got a job. There are reports to send, meetings to schedule and facilitate, the occasional season of performance reviews to go through. And everyone is always so busy. When you step back, it makes you wonder if everyone is just going to keep slowly walking towards the abyss until the project or game fails. Is this what it means to be a leader in games? In tech? To endlessly repeat the same sequence of meetings without really moving the needle? To spend hours trying to get Jira tickets and dashboards where they should be? To pretend that everything is fine when you know deep down it really isn't? It doesn't have to be this way. You can make a difference. You can help your team and game succeed, but sometimes you need a bit of help to get there. I've started a game dev leadership accelerator. It aims to level up leaders who see opportunities to make a difference but don't know how to capitalize on them. We'll walk through what it means to lead well and give you tools to understand your organization's challenges and implement changes to overcome them. Game dev is hard. Knowing how to lead will give you an edge. It will still be hard, but you'll be ready to tackle it. If you're interested, let me know below, hit the link. I hope to see you in the accelerator because I believe better leaders will help teams make better games, and I look forward to someday playing what you create. Okay, let's talk about meetings for a second here. So moving forward, one of the things that people often complain about, and this was in that first example where they went from 2-week sprints to 3-week sprints to save leaders meeting time, this idea of shorter iterations, that just means we're all going to be in meetings. And really, shorter iterations don't have to mean more meeting time at all. This is a myth. In fact, my experience is almost the opposite. The shorter my iteration is, the less time we're spending in meetings, because it's much harder to plan for a very long planning cycle, right? If I'm like planning for 6 months, I feel like I have to spend weeks doing that. Versus if I'm planning for like a day, I can do that in a very short amount of time if my team is ready and used to doing that. It takes some getting used to, but once you're into it, you can actually spend very little time in meetings and get a lot out of it because you don't have to plan that much to plan for a day or 3 days or a week. So let me give you some examples of what this might look like for a simple 3-day iteration. So 3-day iteration, on day 1, we will both close the last sprint and open the new one. So what that looks like, there's a review and a plan. And that might total take 60 minutes. We might do 30 minutes of review and 30 minutes of planning, and that's it. That's the only serious meeting we have in this 3-day iteration. The other 2 days, we do a stand-up, 10 to 15 minutes of stand-up. And so that's what you've got going on. We actually take the retro, we take it out of the 3-day iteration entirely. We turn it into a weekly or a bi-weekly thing. I like 30-minute retros. Some people go for an hour. Sometimes I actually like 30-minute or less. I've done 15-minute, 20-minute retros and gotten a lot out of them. But you don't have to be doing your meetings on the 3-day cadence that you have, the 3-day sort of iteration loop that you've got going on. And so this is a very lightweight way to run 3-day iterations and continue doing them. Let's say you had a 1-week iteration, which again is my preference, my default. If a team came to me and asked like, hey, how long should our iteration be? I didn't know anything about them, but that they worked in game dev. I would say, well, let's start with 1 week and then figure out some of the dials and figure out where you might be. But what that looks like is on Monday, we're going to do a planning session. That might be anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes. Usually what will happen is over time, as the team gets better at it, they'll get better at bringing it down in absolute time. Although some of that will be through investment during the week and being ready for it. Then Tuesday to Thursday, and really Tuesday to Friday, you're going to be doing stand-ups. And then on Friday, you do your review and perhaps a retro. And the review might be 30 minutes. It might be 30 to 60. The retro is going to be 30 minutes still. You cadence your meetings so that they are getting what you need out of them. You understand what they're there for. You get that out of them so that they add maximum effectiveness. You don't let your meeting cadence dictate your iteration length. You let the iteration length be something that's based on the work, the volatility, and human patterns. So that's a look at a 3-day pattern and a 1-week pattern. And a lot of you are familiar with like a 2-week pattern, what that would look like. I'm not going to go into all these. You can hopefully extrapolate from here. Okay, what about iteration length by phase in game development? So here, it's interesting. We actually have a bit of a negative paradigm. So you start in ideation, maybe as early pre-production, but really I think in concept and ideation and prototyping with smaller iterations. Maybe it's daily iterations. Maybe it's a couple days, out to 3 days. Tops, I would say a week, but really I want it tighter than that because here's where we're doing a lot of learning. We're keeping our work in progress things small. We're asking very specific questions. They might be huge questions, but we're doing quick tests to understand. We're doing a lot of learning and a lot of understanding. Is this a good idea or not? And once we've answered enough of those questions, we move into the pre-production really more fully, and we move into production. And now we start expanding that because we have a little bit more stability. We've answered the core questions about what the game is and some things. And as the further we go through this, the more I go from like 1 week probably in the pre-production area to probably out to 2 weeks. Although my default, I still prefer 1 week even in production. But if someone was 2 weeks in production with larger teams, I think that'd be fine. And that's when we have stability. That's when we understand what our game is. And this is really about getting it done. Yes, we're still learning. Yes, we're still delivering valuable bits and play testing and figuring some things out. But the questions are getting smaller and less overall impactful. There's less likely to be giant pivots, hopefully, by the time you're in production. And so you can have a little bit more space of like, we plan, we know what we're going to do a little bit better. We execute against that. We still have the 1 or 2 week cycles to allow us to adjust and to realize, oops, we made some mistakes. Let's fix it and pivot. But it's okay if we work on something not quite optimal for a week in there. It's not going to be that big a deal once we're deep into production. And then once you get back towards shipping, like you're in post-production and you're doing final burn down, you're trying to figure this out. This is where like you're back into daily micro iterations, or honestly really a flow state where everybody's just thinking, okay, what is the highest impact thing I could be doing that can get this game over the line? How do I make sure that thing gets done enough, like not completely, not to done, just enough so that I can move on to the next most important thing. And that might be smashing through bugs. It might be doing polish on key areas, but you're constantly comparing things to each other and adjusting priority. And your design leadership or your product leadership is going to be very, very active. They might be the same thing at your company, but they're going to be very active in prioritizing that. That's where honestly, I might move to a flow-based system, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then some quick discipline notes on this. So yeah, I talked about like meetings, just what's a 3-day iteration, what's a 1 week iteration. I just talked about what phases look like and how I might recommend different iterations lengths for different phases of development. Then we'll get into discipline notes. Look, a lot of times in cross-functional environments, you're going to be sharing iterations, and that's fine. A couple things to consider here. One, if your design, I almost like design running micro iterations inside of whatever other iteration is going on. So if a cross-functional team is using weekly or bi-weekly iteration length, I almost want design, like, can you every day make some changes and turn around a playtest, make some changes, turn around a playtest, and keep doing that. And everybody else is checking in on whatever their cadence might be that fits inside of their planning cycle, that like 2 week iteration loop. But design they're the learning engine. They are the thing that is going to bottleneck us in terms of understanding what the value we're providing is more often than not. Sometimes it's engineering when the tools aren't ready or when things like that are out of place. But design can often move a little bit faster, and often that adds so much more value when they do move faster. The last thing I want is a designer like taking his time testing something that is important for the core game loop. Like I want that just to be happening constantly. So design, you can work with everybody else's iteration, but honestly, I almost like you running micro iterations that are more based around the playtests. For engineering, 1 week default, I like it. Tighten it as you can, and depending on where you are in development cycle. But I like the 1 week default there. The thing that will really enable this, by the way, is you taking care of the technical infrastructure, having a good CI/CD, having good automated testing, like these sorts of things in place. That's what's going to enable engineering to really shine and have shorter, valuable iterations without feeling like, oh no, whenever I make anything, we don't have time to really, test it, check it in, have it go through QA, all these sorts of things. So making sure you're investing in those things will allow engineering to move quickly, and that'll, again, tighten those learning loops. And then for art and content, this is when where a lot of people just go, well, why we shouldn't be iterating? We should just need to run a plan-based system. There are times where that's true. When there is a very stable pipeline of known things, there's dozens or hundreds of assets that the artists are creating, and it's very stable. We know what they are, and they're flowing through the system in a very consistent way. There's not disruption. Everybody's an expert, knows what to do. Style guide's locked in. We're on the same page. This is where, honestly, going plan-based might be fine. I don't see this in reality as much as people think it exists. What I often see is people who claim that's what's going on, but when I actually take 3 steps in, I see people who don't really understand why they're doing what they're doing, how it relates to value. The style guide is unclear. The artists are struggling to connect their work to value in a way that helps them stay aligned. feedback isn't occurring. And so we're constantly getting injections. Things are coming back in the pipeline because, wait a minute, this didn't actually look the way it's supposed to, or this doesn't match the level that the NPC is going to be on. I think 1 week loops here is also good. I think for art and content, they should also default to that 1 week, and maybe again, tighter early on. When you're in the concept stage for things, like, can we just turn something rough around really rapidly? I'm less concerned about this being some amazing, well-rendered image for a CV. I really want just like, does this get us moving in the right direction well? And, you might be concerned, you're like, I'm not trying to disrespect you there. But this is a way to keep things moving. And again, the fact that we're doing it in 3 days doesn't mean you have to go from start to finish in 3 days. It just means you need to make a valuable iteration or cause learning to occur in those 3 days. That's what you're trying to do, just like engineering, just like design. So there we go. We talked about a couple different lengths. We talked about different phases. We've talked about some disciplines and how I relate to iterations around them. If you're discipline-centric, that also might be helpful to you. What are some anti-patterns I see in this? The most common anti-pattern I see around iterations that make them kind of useless is a team that is constantly rolling work from one iteration into the next that they didn't get done. So there's a bunch of reasons why this happens, but the simple one is they're not respecting that reciprocal commitment with the business, with the stakeholders and leaders around them. And they're just like, oh, we didn't get it all done. We pulled in 7 things and we got 4 of them done. The other 3 we didn't get done. We'll pull them into the next one, but they're almost done. We'll pull another 6 things in too. And I've seen this just happen over and over and over. And what ends up being the reality is the iteration does just become the meeting cadence. And then there's work just continuously like messily flowing underneath that. And it's a disaster. If you are having this happen, if you are rolling work from one iteration to the next constantly, something's going wrong inside of your system. And as a leader, if you're a leader, you need to start figuring out how to really limit what's brought in, stop the overcommitting, start slicing things better. Whatever it is, you need to shrink the scope, protect the focus of the team so that we can commit to something, get it done, and then get on to the next thing. This constantly rolling things over really messes up the team's ability to focus on and complete the most important work, because what you'll have happen is the most important thing will enter the team. It'll not get done in the first sprint. It'll roll into the second one. More work will come in. Everybody will be split among all this different work, and it'll drag to the third, and it'll drag to the fourth. And this thing that was supposed to be the most important thing we could do, let's say 4 sprints later, and then maybe you're using weekly sprints, like 4 weeks later, now this thing's still not done. We still haven't learned this lesson or gained this value. That is a huge mistake. You do not want that. So again, this is the most common problem I see, and this is on the team side. It is not taking your iterations seriously. It's not taking the commitment to commit to some work and get that work done. And if we don't, to take seriously, what are we going to change so that does happen next time? I have had teams where I've forced them to take no new work in because the work was rolling over and enough work was rolling over that I was like, sorry, I'm not going to let you take anything else. And they're like, but we're going to finish all this in 3 days. That's not what happened. I don't even think they finished it in that whole sprint without taking anything new in. And you realize just how easy it is for teams to overcommit. One of the reasons I see this a lot, by the way, plans. Oftentimes, there's a plan that sits on top of the iterations, and it's already looked through the backlog, and the plan says that these tickets will be in this sprint, and these tickets will be in this sprint, and these tickets will be in this sprint. And when we get to sprint 2, even though a ticket from sprint 1 that was supposed to be done isn't done, we grab everything that was supposed to be in sprint 2 and we pull it in because that's what the plan says. If you're doing this, you aren't actually iterating. You're just following a plan and you've got iterations acting as a play pretend layer. Again, it becomes just about meeting cadence. Just acknowledge you're in a plan-based system and then recognize, is a plan-based system the right one? We will talk about that too in a second. So, most common one, work rolls over, nobody cares. It breaks the value of the iteration. Second thing, the biggest problem I see, so if that's the most common problem, the biggest problem I see, the one that I think is most crippling, is when leaders and stakeholders around the team are constantly injecting work into that team. They're disrupting whatever's going on. Mid-iteration, they come in and they say, wait, no, not that thing, this thing, and whatever it is. This causes no end of pain. You can imagine a team where every time they start working on something, they get it between 30 to 70% done, and then in swoop somebody says, stop working on that thing. Here's now the new most important thing. And so they start working on that thing and they get that to 30 to 70% done. They get to the end of the sprint and everybody says like, well, we failed our sprint because, we got injections and everybody changed what we were working on. People are like, well, you failed your sprint. It's your fault. But then like, why isn't that thing done? Well, because you told us to do this other thing. And you have teams where they have a whole ton of work that is not done and is going stale, like getting more and more useless over time as everything moves on, the code base, the art, everything else moves on. All the stuff is growing useless. It's not completed. And they have this pile of work that's like all 50% done. They can't do anything with it now. And, a month or two goes by and then everybody starts yelling at the team, like, why don't you ever get any value done? This is the worst. And it's the leader's responsibility. It's the stakeholders around. They're injecting in. If you are a leader and you're seeing this, one of the biggest responsibilities you have is to try to step between those disruptions and from those stakeholders and leaders and the team. The more you can get between that, the better, because I understand why this happens. The rate at which we can think about what's important is faster than the rate at which work can get done. And so if we change our mind about what's important as a senior leader, it's easy to just tell someone, oh, do this instead. The problem is we don't realize that has a cascade of impacts and it's much harder to build that thing than it is to think about it. And if we do that a lot, you end up with a team stuck. That's not where you want to be. So be wary of this one. If you're the senior leader, realize this is happening and slow down. And a simple way to do this is just to back off and say, okay, again, if it's an iteration-based system, there are places I can inject into the system. It's in a review. It's for the planning meeting. I can talk to the leaders who are in charge of the backlog, whoever they are. And I can try to get my things reprioritized near the top. That's fine. But once work has been started, leave it alone. And if you do this, the team will start trusting you. And even if that means that some not perfectly optimal work gets done, it's better to get some work done than to get the most valuable work that's always changing, only half done forever. Because that actually means you do nothing. And I've seen that. So, two anti-patterns we talked about so far: work rolling from iteration to iteration, and second one, leaders constantly injecting work mid-iteration. The third one, I kind of alluded to this at the very beginning. There's this 2-week inertia that's everywhere in software and in games. Like, whoa, we run 2-week sprints, 2-week iterations. Like, that's the standard, right? I wish it wasn't. I understand why it was. And actually, when software development first started doing this, it was because they had been working in 6-month or 9-month or multi-year sort of efforts with giant plans, and the idea of doing monthly iterations was wild, was crazy, was novel, and some people even went even more insane and did 2-week. But in my experience, in most of game development, from small like startups to indie to AAA stuff, 2 weeks is a long time. And a lot can change in 2 weeks. And often we want feedback more often than that, especially if we're design heavy, especially if we're early in development for sure. But honestly, even when we're in production, going a couple of weeks without having the team come together is sort of replan and be able to pivot can feel really bad. It can feel far too stretched. So I like 1 week. The way I'd get there, if you're feeling that 2-week inertia, well, everybody's 2-week sprints. That's what everybody does. That's the right way to do it, right? No, nothing says that anywhere. Something you might do is try out 1 week. Get a team that is actually more impacted by the higher volatility. Maybe they're in a particularly volatile space, or maybe they're able to do those chunks of work or the learning in a smaller amount of time. Have them pilot what might it look like to look at 1 week and see how that goes, and make sure you cut down those meetings. Make sure that it's not an overwhelming, doesn't overwhelm them or feel be really clear about what they gained from this, and then have that 1 week pivoting iteration cycle going on for them. You might get a lot more than you expect out of it, and it may prove to the organization, well, 1 week can work. In so many environments where I started with 2, I ended up going to 1 and liking it, and so did the team. And then the other anti-pattern that I mentioned above that was, again, in that first story, long iterations to reduce meetings. The idea that I'll go from 2-week sprints to 3-week sprints so that we are in less meetings. You should be in longer meetings if you're in longer iterations. And so you might be saving yourself some amount of number of meetings on calendar, but you're actually losing that in longer meetings and less accuracy of those meetings, in my opinion. Because in a system that is experiencing change, and so that you're using an iteration-based approach, if I try to plan 4 weeks in advance, right? If I'm trying to plan a month at a time, and I'm doing that in like a long meeting, one, it takes me a lot of time to try to think about, okay, what are we going to do in week 1? What are we going to do in week 2? What are we going to do in week 3? And there's a lot that can go wrong in there because how many times, again, if you've ever been in these situations, we didn't get all we wanted to done in week 1, but we'll catch up later. You don't catch up later. We didn't get all we wanted to done in week 2. Okay, well, we'll catch up later. No, you don't catch up later. We get into week 3, week 4, it becomes a mess. And now everybody's rushing and we realize we're not going to get everything done that we had. And a lot of it's like, well, the planning was bad and we'll try to plan better. But the problem wasn't the planning. The problem was over the course of a month, a lot changed. And we couldn't predict everything that was going to happen between week 1 and week 4. We can't even predict it for week 1, but we have a much better guess of it. So don't go to long iterations to reduce meetings. You can decouple the meeting cadence from the iteration length if you want. And also make sure that you're just trying to cap meeting length regardless. Like a simple rule of thumb from Mike Cohn that I heard once that I really like is you don't do more than 1 hour of meetings per week that you're planning. And so you hold to that as best you can. And you can go less than that, but don't do more than that. And I have had teams on 2-week sprints that had like a 1 hour meeting, like planning meeting, every sprint. And that was it. Just like that was the start of the sprint. We did a 1 hour planning meeting, got it knocked out, moved on. So that's technically half hour a week. You can get there when the team is ready, when you have the backlog in good order, when people are taking care of what they need to take care of so that this iteration is function properly. Hey, leaders and game devs, if you love what we do here at Building Better Games, imagine what we could create with your support. By joining our Patreon, you help us bring deeper insights, develop better training, and host more expert discussions to level up your leadership and game development skills. Plus, as a patron, you're going to get exclusive behind-the-scenes content, early access to episodes, and a chance to ask your burning questions directly to us. Join now and help us build better games together. We've talked about anti-patterns now. Let's talk about when you don't use iterations at all. Because iterations are one of 3 systems. Iteration-based systems are one of 3 systems. There's iteration-based, there's plan-based, there's flow-based. So we just done a lot of talking about when iteration-based might be helpful to you. It's when I think you want a mix of regular pivots, but also some stability for the team to do work. It's a great base point. It's a great starting point with a recognition that the world is changing and we want to be able to respond to that change. We recognize that that's just part of the soup we swim in game development. You might be in a plan-based environment. When are you in a plan-based environment? You're in a plan-based environment when steps are known, the people you know are available, the people have the skill set, the people have the resources that they need, and change is rare. None of that is likely to change over the course of whatever the plan is. I find this to be very rarely true in game dev. People that have claimed like, oh yeah, that's where we're operating. When you go and you look at it, it's like, no, you're not. You should not be using a purely plan-based system for this because the assumption of the plan-based system is that I can really break all the work down into a granular enough layer and then layer it all out and expect that to actually become reality. And there's so much uncertainty inside of game dev, even well-defined game dev, like making a sequel or something like that, that you're still running into trouble. A place where maybe you could get away with this is like ports, where you have a very crisp idea of what you're doing. Even there, though, the engineering complexity of some of those ports makes it so that, like, be careful. How might I use plan-based? I might have an overall plan-based scheme that sits lightly, like a release or milestone-based plan that sits lightly with iterations running inside of it. But if I do that, I want the iterations to be more important than the overall plan. The overall plan is my common basis for change. It's the thing that needs to react and respond to the changes of what we learn in the iterations, not the other way around. So if you're going to run plan-based, have it a light overall layer, or be in that place where everything is known, the work is super well defined. If you're in that crystal clear defined space, you're basically a factory at that point. A plan can function. The other version is flow-based. It's kind of on the opposite end. So if plan-based is on one extreme where I know everything, what happens when I know nothing? Here I'm in flow-based. This fits service teams really well, like IT in an organization, or localization, or player support, customer support, things like that, where they're getting tickets and we never know how many tickets exactly we're going to get, but we need to respond to them and get them done as fast as possible. You're not really focused on days or weeks. You're really focused on what's the most important piece of work and how do I get it done as rapidly as possible, as fast as possible. And you just keep doing that as rapidly as you can through the system. You can use this with the development teams. I think those development teams need to be more mature to pull this off well. Otherwise, I think it reduces to chaos. But when you have a lot of volatility in your system that you may be able to not solve, like you can't resolve it, you can't. It's not because leaders are behaving badly or anything like that. It's just like we're just operating in a world with massive uncertainty. Like a knock might be something like this, where like when something goes wrong, we all have to be able to respond to that, drop whatever we're doing, and react to the outage or whatever it might be. So you're going to use things like WIP limits. You're going to try to manage your flow through the system instead of thinking about we're planning in advance what we're going to do over the next X amount of time, because you can't plan for it. So you use flow-based. High responsiveness, highest discipline required on these teams. And it's a good place to be at if you can be there. But not everybody needs to be there. So that's your 3: plan-based, iteration-based, flow-based. Okay, so some just really practical recommendations from me about how I think you should tackle this. First, if I knew nothing else but that you were in game dev, I would say start at 1 week iterations. It's human intuitive. It really fits nicely at like a Monday starter and a Friday finish. Or if you want to be really clever, you could do like a Wednesday start and a Tuesday finish. But I've seen different versions of this. But once it's in, it's like people can lock into that rhythm and they can just go like, yep, got it. I know how my week flows. I know how this is going. I think it's enough time for a decently functioning team and almost any discipline to get a meaningful chunk of work done, like to produce value or to produce some sort of learning. So start at 1 week. Second thing, tune using those 3 dials. Remember those 3 dials. It's what does it mean? Like how long does it take us to get a meaningful chunk of work done? Be that a value slice or a valuable piece of learning. Second thing, how much volatility is there in the system? And 3, what are the human rhythms that we're just trying to match to? Third thing I would say, be comfortable decoupling meetings that don't need to be directly associated with your iteration. Planning probably does need to be associated with your iteration length. Stand-ups don't need to be, they can be every day. But maybe you have a review like if you were running really, really tight iterations, you might do different types of reviews. You might scale your reviews so that I have like a team review every iteration, but I have a stakeholder review that's less frequent than that. And that's fine. You can do things like that. And like I mentioned with the retro, you can decouple the retro to be, every week or every 2 weeks, regardless of what your iteration would be. In fact, if you were running really long iterations, like let's say you're running 6 weeks iterations or something like that, I would still say you should probably be doing retros every week or two. It should be much more often than your iteration cadence in order for you to really create some learning in there. So final recommendation, bias towards shorter rather than longer when it comes to iterations. This is one of the biggest mistakes I see, is that when people aren't sure, they tend to go up rather than down. And I think they should go down. It's really obvious if you go down, then when like this isn't working. But when you go up, it starts masking problems inside of your system. If you have a terrible CI/CD system that doesn't actually allow people to check in quickly, but you iterate every 4 weeks, it's not really that noticeable. It's hard to catch. Whereas if you try to go to 1 week and you discover like, holy cow, check-ins are a disaster. Our build system sucks. This is useful information. And this is one of the reasons that like I like reducing the iteration, because it reveals problems inside of the system that are masked at longer cadences. That problem I brought up at the beginning, they were going 2 weeks. They went to 3 because leaders were in too many meetings. They weren't solving the real problem, in my opinion. They should have had plenty of time. Meetings shouldn't have been a big problem for leaders at the 2 week mark. In fact, they should have been able to go to 1 week and had even less hours of meetings on the calendar, in my opinion. But because they were seeing meetings as the issue and meeting load as the issue, they went the other way to try to solve this, and it sort of covers the issue while creating anti-patterns inside of the organization that involve slower learning loops and less flexibility inside of a time where they really needed flexibility. So those are my recommendations. Start at 1 week, use the 3 dials, be comfortable decoupling meetings. And last thing, bias towards shorter iterations, not longer iterations. Here's a quick checklist for you to think about as you look at your iteration cycle today and maybe think about what you should shift around it. First question, did we deliver visible value or learning in the last iteration, and does that happen regularly? The answer is no. Is that because we're biting off too much and we need to narrow like slice narrower to get value we're learning? Or is that because we just can't get value we're learning in this tight of a time frame? Second question, did outside changes blow up the plan, and does that happen a lot? So look back over the last few iterations. How often did injections, volatility? Again, it doesn't mean anybody's doing anything wrong. Sometimes it's just part of the system. But if that's happening a lot, you might want to tighten your iteration to decrease the chance of that happening. If you're 4 days into a 5-day iteration and something, bad happens, it often makes sense just to finish it out and then pick it up in the next cycle. But if if you're 4 days into a 2-week iteration and that same thing happens, it's like, oh man, are we really going to lose an entire week when we know this other thing is much more important now? It becomes a much harder question. So tightening those iterations can help you deal with the volatility inside of the system. Another question to ask, do we feel like our cadence makes sense for just human beings and the teams around us? Is this something that's fitting into the rhythm of the company, into the rhythm of the team? Just because it's not fitting into the rhythm of the company doesn't mean it's wrong, but it may mean we need to do things to help the rest of the organization be comfortable with what we're doing. And so it's important to keep that. And that's also just that human legible. Like, is this something where we are sitting in natural human rhythms? Like, don't have the 12-day sprint because that was what ended up being the data-driven perfect way. Use common sense here. So last question, do leaders and the team honor the leave us alone, we'll deliver deal? This one's huge. If this isn't happening, you're not actually getting the value out of iterations you could be. It could be because the team's not delivering. It could be because you're not being left alone. Whatever it is, if something's going wrong there, if people aren't viewing this as because we're using iterations, so we commit to work and we deliver that work at the end of the iteration, and you don't interfere unless if you absolutely have to, and that should be very, very rare. Is that working? If that's not working, you have some things to figure out, and they don't involve iteration lengths. So there you go. Kind of final short summary, iteration length is not a meeting schedule. It's a way to understand your speed of learning, your speed of value delivery. I would recommend defaulting to 1 week. You tune with the 3 dials, protect your commitment. You're going to ship a lot better. You're going to ship more. You're going to learn faster. You're also going to build trust better. Okay. We'll wrap up with that. If you're a leader stuck in slow loops and broken systems, the Game Dev Leadership Accelerator is built to help you make these changes stick. I level up your leadership so that you know how to handle it when people bring you questions around topics like this. I'd love to see you there. So link in the description.